more expensive notion about ethics. And this expensive notion, not necessarily the ultimate manifestation, one of the important manifestation of this expanded notion is the possibility for the human to form one body. The word body is important, with heaven, earth, and the myriad things. And we have to understand what it means. 4 dimensions are involved in this mode of thinking. If you miss one, if you focus on the other 3, sometimes we focus on only 2, and you will not be able to understand what's going on as Confucian mode of reasoning. In fact, it will become very impoverished. Not only partial, but impoverished. And these 4 dimensions are integrated, at least they are linked in a way. For example, when you want to think about Confucian ethics, first of all, the framework or the frame of reference will have to involve all 4. And you're familiar with them. Last time I put them on the board. Self, community, nature, and heaven, no matter how you try to put it. And we know that in most forms of moral reasoning, we try to fix the relationship between self and community. And we just try to think, human rights, privacy that is something that should not be interfered from forces from the outside, and how through our own cultivation we'll be able to link to the community, and the community is of course variously understood. Often we do not pay too much attention to the family. We put a lot of emphasis on the government, on society. And of course, importance of family, again, is distinctively Confucian, and there's a reason why family is so important. I did mention the complexity of family relationships, but more than that. Now, the first aspect of the dimension is the question of the self. And I've noticed, I've emphasized time and time again, the idea of the self involves both the body and the mind, is never an isolated individual. Never imagine the self as an island. The self, you're going to imagine it, the metaphor is a flowing stream. And it's always dynamic, it's always changing, it's always ceaseless. I mean, in terms of the process. In order to deal with the self, we need to understand the self dynamic. It's not a static structure, it is a dynamic process. So the self flows. And because that's the conception of the self, so in order to capture it, and it took me a while to try to think about it, it's essential relationships. That's the self. Now, at the level of the center, both are important. Many scholars in Confucian studies focus on relationships. Therefore, Confucian ethics is social ethics. But I also put a lot of emphasis on the center. That's the reason why Confucius said, learning for the sake of the self, not just learn for others. And if you don't learn for the sake of the self, there's no center, there's no centeredness. And even if you can serve others, they eventually turn out to be inauthentic. The true ability to serve others is that you know yourself. You've cultivated yourself. And that sense of the self is open, is pluralistic. In other words, each and every human being is so different. So each and every human being will have a particular way of self-cultivation. You cannot just trade it with anyone else. And yet you learn from your friends, you learn from teachers, you learn from the outside world in order to enhance your sense of the person. And another thing, we never got into this, it becomes more complicated, is that it's not simply horizontal expansion. In the Great Learning, the idea that you should extend to the people who are very close to you and then even to strangers and beyond. But it's also this, this is the broadening process, but it's also a deepening process. The more you understand yourself, the more you'll be in a position to understand others. And so, to move from the self, the center of the self, in terms of relationships, is not simply to expand oneself, but to have deepening self-understanding. And you are able to communicate with other human beings, even with animals and plants. How do you communicate? Of course, it's an interesting question. It's based upon your deepened self-realization or self-understanding. The example I use is like digging a well. You dig deeply into the well, you reach the common spring which flows. And not that you abstract yourself, from those forces that shape you as an individual. So one thing the Confucians are absolutely critical, that is the individual is so different. The individual has these complicated relationships that cannot be duplicated with anyone else. Well, assuming a very extreme example that you become cloned. So we have the other you sitting beside you, because both of you occupy different space, and you're different. Just imagine the two are totally identified. And of course, each one of you will experience different sense of time. Twins eventually will have a lot of things to share, but many twins turn out to be very different. So each human being is very different. And yet there's something that we all share. That's our heart and mind. That's our nature. And the nature is differentiated from other members of the animal kingdom. But we share 99%, maybe 99.9% the nature with all the other animals, all the instincts of other animals we have. And yet each instinct in the human situation is fundamentally different. Most of the animals would not eat themselves, to death. They would never eat more if they're satisfied. And maybe you find other examples, maybe exceptional examples, but human beings can do all kinds of things according to your habits, your design, and in a way, the human activity cannot be understood simply by observing behavior of animals. Even though we learn a great deal, even from ants. This is at Wilson's marvelous achievement of understanding ants or bees to understand human community. But that's only a partial understanding. So, at the center of the self, and there's something already quite complex. So one question the self would have to deal with is how you relate to a community. There are two very different positions. One is that the linkage is always tenuous. Your dignity as a person is your ability to challenge community. And one radical position is that freedom begins when you say no to the community. So if you're not alienated from the group, you will never be truly free. And sometimes we experience that. I'm not saying this is wrong. This is a very strong position. Therefore, there's a separation between yourself in terms of self-realization and social service. You should make up your mind. If you do one, then the other will suffer. Now, maybe idealistic, but I think important to keep in mind, this is again rather unique in the Confucian tradition, that is, each one of us is fated to be a particular person. And that sense of being fated is that there's so many constraints. We mentioned about the family, but if you look at a person, there's so many constraints that make us a concrete living person here and now. Not only concrete, but living and present here and now. And of course, we talk about all these constraints, and our ethnicity, our gender, our place of birth, our age cohort, our language,